Carlyne Remedios. Welcome to the ROHFIT Life Pod. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me, and I think I'm excited for this topic because I think it's an important topic to talk about, and I'm glad people are talking about it a lot. I think mental health and nutrition, the sync between the two, people are realizing it now. It's an emerging field. There's a lot of research going on in this field, so it's exciting. So I'm looking forward to this one.
I'm glad. Before we move on, just a recap again from the last podcast. What is your background? What is your expertise? And which field do you come from?
So I'm an accredited practicing dietitian. I've done my master's in dietetics from Deakin University in Melbourne. I've been practicing nutrition and dietetics for almost 13 years now. A lot of my work has been in clinical nutrition, helping people with weight-related issues, with chronic lifestyle diseases. So it's pretty much what I've sort of done pretty much my entire life and in my entire career is in the space of nutrition and dietetics, and that's what I'm passionate about.
That's really nice. So, moving on to our topic of today, which is the relationship between nutrition and mental health. So, before we move on, I just want to give the audience, the viewers, kind of like a recap on the fact that mental health is an issue that is progressively rising, especially after COVID, because COVID was itself a very isolating event. So a lot of the people were like a little too closed off with their emotions, closed off with their feelings. And the only thing that lots of people, kind of changed during the COVID period was their dietary habits. And today I wanted to kind of delve into the fact of how nutrition and diet plays a big role in your moods, your mental health, how your energy levels are, what is the connection between your gut and your brain, and all that good stuff. So before moving on, I just wanted to break down the first question, which is what is the relationship? Because I know that there is a relationship between the gut and the brain. And like with the little research that we did, I just want to know on a very layman level, what would you say, how deeply connected is the gut and the mind?
There's a constant conversation with the gut and the mind, and that's something that that's being researched extensively nowadays. We've always sort of we've always spoken about the fact about having a gut feeling, right? You don't feel right about something. It's sort of been there. We've always spoken about it. But now there's science to sort of actually say that the gut and the mind are constantly talking. A lot of it is to do with the fact of with the microbiota in our gut that's constantly talking to our brain. So the food that we eat, the nutrition that we get from the food, obviously influences a lot of our moods, but it also we know from a lot of study now is that it actually influences the way our brain functions. So the risk of diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia, there is a correlation between the food that we eat and the nutrition that we take in to actually lowering your risk of developing those diseases. I mean, there is the genetic factor of it. We can't do much about it. There's environmental risk factors that we do have a little bit, sort of say in that. And nutrition is something that we can make a difference in immediately. And the good thing about, the food that we eat and the nutrition is that our gut microbe actually changes pretty much immediately if we make a change in their diet. I mean, for the good or for the bad. So if you do have even a couple of days of good eating habits, it can actually affect the gut microbiota, and vice versa. If you have a couple of days of really bad eating, then it can affect it adversely as well. But there's that constant conversation happening, and we cannot sort of ignore that, right? I think just to sort of put things in perspective, when you talk about the brain per se, 60% of the brain is fat. It's probably the fattiest organ in our body, right? It's not the fat that we're talking about, not the adipose tissue or the fat that's around our bellies, but basically the brain is the fattiest organ because there's so much of the way the brain functions is there's a lot of electricity that's sort of going on. So that brain fat actually helps to sort of preserve the brain tissue. So, I think historically we've always been about low fat diets and, fat is bad for you and we shouldn't be eating fat. But now we know that we actually need fat for a lot of protective functioning. And the type of the fat and the quantity of the fat is what matters. So, there's a lot of interplay between nutrition, the brain functioning, and mental health. So we can't ignore that for sure.
Correct. There was a fun fact that I didn't know much about, that the brain is the fattiest organ, and a lot of that is the direct connection between the diet and your mental synapses, your neurons going off, it's kind of pain, pleasure, everything is kind of housed in that area. So yeah, I wanted to know how deep in research has this study gone, because I've heard a lot about the gut brain axis. I've heard a lot about these concepts where literally a person's moods, everything from anxiety to depression to even panic attacks, everything can be dependent on certain foods that we eat, and they can be at a very quick response, or some of them even on a delay. Like if something you eat in the previous night can start showing results the next day. So what research and what studies have been done in recent times in regards to that?
So I think what's worth mentioning here is what we call as the SMILES trial, which is done by an Australian group of researchers. Basically, it was done over 6,000 odd adults in the age group of, say, I think around 50 to 75. So they've taken the senior citizen population and actually randomized them into groups where one of them actually received nutrition counseling from an accredited practicing dietitian, telling them in terms of what to eat and giving them that support, and one that didn't get that nutrition sort of focus. And they found that the ones that actually received that nutritional and dieting counseling actually did much better in terms of their mental health, as opposed to the ones that didn't receive that. So it was just sort of trying to put down in research that what we knew all this while. We know food effects, we know nutrition effects, but this trial is actually the basis, and it sort of gave a lot of weightage to what we sort of knew but didn't sort of have in research. We will link the study because it's a long study. It's an interesting study. They basically utilize the Mediterranean diet, which basically focuses on a lot of fresh fruits and veggies and nuts and legumes. They basically used that when they were counseling the subjects in terms of, nutrition. So it was over a period of, I think, 3 or 4 years that the study took place. But that's an interesting study because I think that was one of the groundbreaking research into, finding that connection between nutrition and mental health. That's worth sort of talking about. And a lot has sort of come out as an offshoot of that study. I mean, there's plenty of research in the space of nutrition and mental health. There's papers coming out almost every day. In fact, there was a recent one by a Spanish group in June 2023, a very recent one that actually spoke about the intake of nuts and its effect on mental health. So it was an observational study, but they actually said that when you have a higher consumption of nuts through the week, it actually showed that your cognitive behavior actually improves. So, and that's a specific food. So you're talking about all types of nuts. I mean, it doesn't have to be the exotic kind, but, close to home, we have your peanuts and cashew nuts. So just by increasing your nut consumption through the week, it can actually affect your mental health. So there's a lot of interaction between what you eat, what you don't eat, basis what's going to happen to, what's happening up there.
Funny thing that you mentioned that the nuts bit, there's been a big thing, all of our mothers, every time they say almonds for your memory and badam for your cognitive thinking. And that is something that we usually overlook and we don't actually realize the importance of it. But considering now that studies are kind of picking up and focusing on the changes, of very minute changes, of how over a long period of time the nuts can help your brain, I think that is a big groundbreaking, point that would maybe push our diets to change in the
And see
coming
this,
years.
and that's exactly what you said. We've been doing this all our lives, right? I mean, the Indian diet per se is a very healthy diet. Unfortunately, with globalization and having access to so much of food, we've unfortunately moved more towards the westernized diet, which is basically a lot of high fat and high sugar and a lot of ultra processed foods. But if you look at the traditional Indian diet, the basis of it is legumes and dals and a lot of leafy vegetables, like nuts, we spoke about just now. So I think the more closer we stay to the roots and true to what we've been eating, what our parents and grandparents have been eating, that's the best way to sort of go. Because if you look at the Mediterranean diet, which is probably the most researched diet, and the Mediterranean people are the most healthiest because of the foods that they eat, you can find a lot of similarity between the Indian traditional diet. So a lot of the base of the Mediterranean diet is whole grains. We eat a lot of whole wheat, a lot of millets in our country. I mean, that's something that we've sort of bringing back now. But whole grains is again a staple of our Indian diet. Then they talk about having lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, which again is a large part of the Indian diet. They talk about including legumes, which again is what we do. It's rice and dal is something that all of us eat at home, and that's a combination
staple
of
food.
your grain and your legumes. So there's a lot of similarity between the Mediterranean diet and the Indian diet. We just need to find that connection and modify it a little bit where things aren't too great, and we sort of take the good from from that end and then leave all the sort of bad out. And I mean, olive oil is a huge sort of eating pattern in the Mediterranean diet, and obviously we can argue to say that olive oil is not the most economical for us to buy. I mean, not everyone has access to olive oil, but when you're talking about olive oil, you're also looking at the omega-3s in that. We're looking at the ratio between omega-3 and omega-6s. So you do have oils in like rice bran oil, for example, which is available, that has a good balance of omega and omega-6s. So it's about looking at what we can find in our own space that can benefit our mental health and our nutrition. We don't have to go exotic. We can find local sort of produce that is sort of similar or more nutrition, has more nutrition value than than the Mediterranean diet. So it's about making that sort of connect.
Right. I believe you also spoke about how, again, like bringing back from how the brain is the fattiest of the organs, and like considering like I have a big background in working out, working on my physique, everything. There's something called the neuromuscular, uh, relationship, and majority of what fuels our muscles and fuels our body, I think, would be considered as the diet and the nutrition that we put in. So usually what people say as like, okay, muscle growth, muscle connection. Do you think that diet plays a big role between mind muscular connection? And do you think that that is considering now everything from making your ideal body to getting fit to losing weight, everything has an aspect 80% of nutrition and diet. And considering, do you think that route is via the brain, or do you feel it's directly, what would you say is like the connection between the muscles, the brain, and the diet?
See, I mean, the nutrition or whatever food that we eat is going to fuel our body, right? So, I mean, and there's a direct impact on terms of what you eat versus building muscle and vice versa. So, I mean, the human body is so complex. There's a lot of sort of interplay. I don't think we can look at anything in isolation, right? There's a lot of connection. Like, for example, like we didn't know until recently, for example, like the gut can affect the brain, and the nutrition that we eat is going to affect directly our brain. But it is, and so there's constantly so much of research happening. So there is a lot of interplay, there's a lot of interconnection. I don't think we can look at anything in isolation. Nutrition definitely is the foundation, because that's what we do. That's it is the basis of everything. So we definitely, I can't say for sure whether there's a direct connection, but I'm sure that there is an interplay for
Between
sure
the three.
between the three.
Right. Moving on to the next point, which is like if you would give our audience like 5 or 6 basic, say, vitamins, minerals, certain kind of foods that are readily available in our daily supermarkets, in our grocery stores, maybe even in terms of vitamins and minerals, how would you break down something that would be ideal for your brain and your mental health on a daily basis? So
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we spoke about the one most important one already, which is your omega-3s, right? Your omega-3 is found in all your nuts and seeds. So we're talking about, say, walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds. These are your vegetarian sources of omega-3s. And this, I mean, it's something that we can find in any grocery store. Probably everyone has a dabba of nuts in their house. So it's not something that's difficult to get. I think we just need to be more conscious about including that in our diet on a daily basis. So that's your omega-3s from there. The other important vitamins are your B group of vitamins. So vitamin B12, for example, again, has a direct impact in terms of our brain health and our mood when it comes to, but unfortunately, vitamin B12 is got only from animal sources, right? So for those who are following a vegetarian or a vegan lifestyle, then you have to rely on supplements. So especially those who are not eating meat on a daily basis or don't eat meat at all, need to make sure that they're getting their vitamin B12 via supplements, because that's a very, very important vitamin when it comes to brain health. Obviously, we have folic acid, and folic acid we know is very important for the unborn child as well. So, during pregnancy, mothers are told to have folic acid supplements, because that basically is an important nutrient that actually helps neural development. So, folic acid is another important vitamin, and folic acid is present in all your leafy greens. So whether you take your spinach, or you take your methi, or you take your, your green amaranth, or any of your local greens, you get your folic acid there. So these are everyday foods that we're looking at. The other important vitamin from a mental health perspective is vitamin D, which we all know is the sunshine vitamin. That's the biggest source of vitamin D. But what do we do when we don't get out in the sun, or when we're in the monsoons? How do we make sure we get enough of vitamin D? Supplements, yes. Again, important to make sure that you're taking supplements under supervision, because vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin. You don't want to take an excess of it. So making sure you have your levels checked before supplementing, and making sure you get your supplementation after it's been prescribed by a healthcare professional. Of course, there are food sources of vitamin D. Mushrooms, for example, are a great source of vitamin D. You have obviously eggs, and you have your milk and dairy products that are a source of vitamin D. For those that don't consume dairy, if you're using nut milks, making sure that you're getting the nut milks that are fortified with vitamin D, and most of them in the market available, whether it's soy, almond, will have added vitamin D. So make sure you're looking for that. And obviously, your fatty fish, for those who eat fish, fish is again a good source of vitamin D. Another important fact with mushrooms is obviously it is a good source of vitamin D, but the way to enhance it is that if you leave your mushrooms at the windowsill, and it actually enhances the vitamin D. So that's probably a good tip too while you're cooking mushrooms, is make sure that you leave it by the window so it gets enough of vitamin D, and then sort of consume it. In order to be able to get vitamin D from the sun, it's important to make sure that the sun rays actually hit our skin. So if you just need a minimum of, say, 10 to 15 minutes in the sun, but making sure that the sun actually hits your skin. So making sure that either you're wearing something sleeveless, or if you're completely covered and you're going out in the sun, you're not going to get that vitamin D. If you have a layer of sunscreen on, you're not going to get that vitamin D. If you're sitting in your car and you have UV windows, you're not going to get your vitamin D. So that 10 to 15 minutes, making sure that the sun actually hits your skin, that's going to ensure you're getting your vitamin D. Obviously, make sure you don't get burnt in the sun, but that 10-15 minutes is more than enough to get that. So it's easy enough as long as we know the best ways to sort of get it.
So, if we had to break it down with these, obviously nutritional kind of superstars which you mentioned, the issue comes up especially with this current generation, because I believe diet is the most detrimental thing, I would say, because every kind of processed food is very readily available. So your supermarkets, your daily midnight snacks, your highly processed trans fat, monosaturated fat kind of food is what is somehow become their daily diet plans, and somehow
it's accessible,
right? And obviously, considering that is a corporate cycle that will not stop no matter how much you try, there will always be there'll be always a new product that comes out in the market that people would buy no matter what, and it would be processed to that level. So do you feel like there is an innate like nature change that people would have to make in terms of that, okay, we have to reduce our processed foods because obviously it is affecting not only our body but also our mental health. You know, a lot of people suddenly, even though if the previous day they enjoyed a dinner outside, or they enjoyed, you know, having a big meal from the grocery store, processed, packed, they usually see the effects more on their mental health, which causes them lethargy. Like I've been on the side of it, where if my diet the previous day has been bad, I feel lethargic, but more than my body, like I can pick up my body, I can start working out, I can start doing anything, but the impact kind of stays, and that spillover happens
You
on
feel
your mood.
sluggish and yeah.
Sluggish, you feel like you don't want to get out of bed, you feel like your productivity has been hit, you know. And obviously we did talk about the gut brain axis before, and apparently it's like a proper measure of how the microbiome in your gut, you know, kind of affects, like the better the flora in your gut, the better your mood will be, the less sluggish you will feel. So do you feel like there is a way where we can inculcate, you know, these kind of cheat meals, these kind of um, okay, we are enjoying processed foods and we are enjoying that, because cutting it out of somebody's life would be kind of impossible unless and until they are that determined. So where do you feel is that nice balance in terms of, okay, this is a cheat day that I'm enjoying, this is a part, like what would the ratio be, like if throughout a week you are to say like 6 days out of the week you are supposed to have that clean diet, you know, kind of household food, you know, non-processed, and that one day you can kind of enjoy, and what is the balance, like what is your ideal ratio?
So see, that's exactly what you said. As long as majority of the days you're eating real food, when I say real food, like you actually know what the food's looking like. Like, see, every food to some extent is processed. Okay. So if you look at your dals, they're going to be processed. That's how you're going to cook it, right? I mean, you're not just eating it from the plant. Or if you're looking at your whole wheat flour, that's also processed. But when you're looking at processed foods, I think we need to understand the difference between processed and ultra processed. So ultra processed is basically that you don't recognize your food at all, and which is pretty much what comes in, in your packet, which is your chips and your fast food and your junk food, which have a lot of calories in it, but don't really have any nutrition in it, right? So also, I think that the reason why I need to say this is because there's this whole sort of influx of people saying that all processed food is bad, but most of your food is going to be processed because that's how you can consume it. We're talking about ultra processed foods where, it's stripped of all the nutrition and you only have the calories in it, or you have the additives and the salt and the sugar that's sort of giving you that hit and making it taste good. So yes, we're never going to be able to completely cut out ultra processed foods from our diet, but I think it's that balance like you spoke about. If you're eating real foods, you're eating a good amount of fresh fruits and vegetables, you're eating your nuts like we spoke about, you're eating your legumes most of the days, and then you can afford to give yourself that one day where you say, okay, I'm going to have, I don't know, like a fast food from an outlet today, and that's fine. But the reverse is when the problem arises, right? So if you're going to have 6 days of bad eating and say, like, what, today I'm going to eat, like roti sabzi, that's not going to do you any good. So you have to make sure that majority of your food intake is food that is good, is actually real food. And I do understand that it's not easy cooking food every day and preparing food every day, but I think what we can do is to be able to become aware of what is available. Like we said, that fast food is more accessible. Like, you have your food delivery services, so you don't really have to make much of an effort to get food. But if we could also understand that there are food choices that are also healthy that you can get from these food delivery services, it doesn't have to be the fast food or the junk food. So I think educating, being aware of what is available. The other thing is, like I always say, is to be organized and to prepare yourself, right? So because if you've gone out and purchased groceries, you're going to cook those groceries. But if you have nothing at home to work with and you only have chips and biscuits and cookies at home, then that's what you're going to sort of end up eating. So making sure that your environment, at least your immediate environment, has foods that are available that are good for you. So always have fruits at home, always have some veggies at home, always have your dried beans and legumes. So you can always work with that. So I think being prepared and being organized and having that available to you in your immediate surrounding you're going to be more inclined than to eat real food, for the lack of a better word.
It's quite interesting because I think there was a while that where I was experimenting, and majority of my diet plans was based on a particular goal in regards to my mental state, in regards to the performance of my cognitive brain. So a lot of people today are very like would like to hack. There's a lot of like this hack culture where people are like, okay, if we do this, we can simplify or better this aspect of my life quickly. And what I realized is that a lot, what I realized is 80% of all good things or bad things that happen in our body in terms of everything from like um, certain issues, certain, infections, certain changes in our body, all start in the gut. So majority of what people, this hack culture now says that I want to make a diet plan as per this, to increase productivity. I want to increase memory. I want to better my physical state, my energy based state. I want to increase my, the fact that I don't need to have one of those dips in the middle of the day in terms of my mood. A lot of mood changes, a lot of hormones are in play. So I wanted to talk more about a different aspect of talking about nutrition via hormones and how that affects your mental health. Because what I realized is like obviously male and female very differential on how their bodies change around the year. And recently I had found out that women's bodies are more seasonal. Women's bodies change or very different, like based on the menstrual cycles, based on how they change throughout the day. you know do you feel like there are diet plans, there are certain types of nutritional foods that can better your hormones, like especially like your serotonin and your dopamine, and each of those influxes throughout the day kind of define your moods, define how much energy you have. So do you feel like people should go after making diet plans particularly to be like, okay, I know for this diet plan, my mood isn't going to dip, or I'm going to reduce my dipping of my mood or my anxiety for that matter, and like kind of have my body on my side when it comes to my mental health. Do you think people should follow that? Because I kind of experimented that in the middle and it really worked well for me. But
I
it's a
mean,
very like,
I think that's a good way of looking at it because I think historically a lot of people just assume that if you follow a diet is for weight loss. Right. And it's I'm glad you mentioned this because that's not what good eating is all about. Yeah. Good eating or following a diet or following a nutrition plan isn't only about losing weight or fitting into a certain dress size or looking good, but there's so much more that good nutrition can do for you, or following a particular diet can do for you. And one of those things is, like we spoke about, is mental health. Like, are you eating the foods that are going to affect your mood? Are you eating foods that are going to make you feel happier and better and more productive? And which is also sort of circling back to the Mediterranean diet. They also have modifications of that, which is the mind diet, which is mainly to sort of help with mental health, or the DASH diet, which particularly talks about sort of keeping your blood pressure under control. Now, these particular diets don't talk about calories or talk about the calorie in, calorie out, but they're talking about nutrition and the nutrients present in that food that can actually help all these other sort of issues we're talking about. So I think that would be really great if we start looking at food and the way we are eating and how it can affect us, other than just focusing on weight and on that number on the scale. I think that will be a refreshing take, and I think it's very important that we understand that what we are eating or not eating has so much to do with all aspects of our life and not just weight. And I think the day that people realize that will be the day. Yeah, absolutely. Because then once you're in a better frame of mind, you're in a better mental state, you realize that everything sort of falls in place as well. So because also I feel, because I've worked in the field of weight loss for so long, I understand that you get so obsessed with that number on the scale, you get so obsessed with not dropping that half a kilo or that kilo a week, that it ultimately sort of backfires because you're only focusing and you're so stressed about that weight that you're not thinking about anything else. You might have improved your fitness level, you probably are able to walk 4 flights of stairs and without, but you're not recognizing those things because you're so focused on the weight. You might be your skin might be looking better, you might be having better energy levels, you probably are more productive at work, but you're not taking those things into consideration because you only focus on the weight. So I think that will be definitely for the future generation, and I think that sort of that mindset has already sort of come in to say that, look, I need to eat better, not to lose weight. I need to eat better to feel good and to better either my mental health or my fitness levels, or just remain overall healthy. So I think that will be a great take on it for sure.
Right, right. I think that was a good connection that, at least for me, I have had a long journey in terms of me being particularly guilty from like having or enjoying a cheat meal or enjoying a meal that was, at that point not optimal for my health. But the next day I would like kind of focus more on that number, focus more on that scale. And that used to take away from the fact that, oh, I perform twice as well in the gym, or I'm actually feeling better. The endorphins are feeling better. The present kind of feels off track because you're not letting your body react to the good kind of endorphins, good kind of food that you are putting in on this current day, but mentally stuck on the you know
the weight and the number on the scale.
Right.
And that's why whenever even when I counsel my clients, I always ask them to set out goals for themselves that are not weight related. Set out what's important to you. Do you want to make sure that you have enough of energy to run around, play with your kids, for example? Are you able to walk up a flight of stairs without getting breathless? I mean, those are the things that are important. So focus on those goals rather than that number, because that number it can change basis so many different factors every single day. You could have water retention, or you could have been constipated, or you could have there's so many things that can sort of move that number. You could have worked out in the gym, put on muscle, and that will show on the scale anyway, which is good weight, but it is going to show on the scale. So it's still a number. So I think we need to focus on other factors, and when we're writing down our goals, to make sure that the goals are not focused on the weighing scale and the number on the scale, but other things that actually matter in life. I think that will be definitely, like you said, a game changer.
So moving on to the next topic, which is basically understanding how the influence, especially like nowadays, caffeine is part of our daily lives. And I'm particularly guilty of it because at this point, I'm really trying to cut down my caffeine, but it's not working. And it has a very weird effect on the brain itself. And considering caffeine is a diuretic, it kind of, everybody gets the feeling that they're dehydrated after that. Your mind has a completely fast 0 to 100 shoot up, but then they also have the crash. And that is something that people sometimes can't ignore. And especially in like the Western countries, they have it like twice, thrice, maybe in like large amounts. So what I wanted to know is how the influence of caffeine on the gut affects the brain, and how it affects mood, it affects energy levels, it affects like so many different aspects of it. What do you think, like, obviously caffeine being a drug, how does it affect our brain?
See, caffeine it's not completely bad and it's not completely good. Like in everything in nutrition, moderation is key, right? I mean, if you're going to go and have like 10, 12 cups of coffee in a day, that's not going to do you any good. Or like you have, I think there was this fad in between where you get caffeine tablets. Again, that's, very high doses of caffeine. Also important to know that different people have different sensitivities to coffee. Like some people will have coffee and they'll have a perfectly good night's sleep. Some people have coffee in the afternoon, they still struggle to sleep at night. So it also depends on individual in terms of how much coffee, or rather caffeine, can affect you. Caffeine per se obviously makes you feel more alert. That's why we have that coffee in the middle of the day, right? Because we want to feel more alert, we want to be more vigilant. And it has shown, like a few studies have shown, that it can also to some extent reduce the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. I mean, these are observational studies. I wouldn't say that that's exactly what's going to happen, but it's not all bad. Obviously, there are some individuals where caffeine is a trigger for their anxiety. They start getting jittery, they start getting more anxious, their panic attacks sort of get worse. So obviously in those scenarios, you want to make sure that you're not having that caffeine would definitely reduce the consumption of caffeine. So that's why I say it's not all good or all bad. It really depends on your sensitivity to it, how much you can manage, what is the effect it's having for you. Right? I mean, coffee does have what we call as phytochemicals or polyphenols, which are basically, bioactive compounds in plant foods that actually, benefit you to some extent. So coffee does have that. So does black tea and, and green tea and cocoa, So they have those beneficial sort of ingredients in them that sort of influence, our gut and are good for our gut. But again, it's not like a blanket rule for everybody, especially sort of coffee. And I think important for me to also mention here that when we spoke about certain nutrients or certain foods that are important for gut health and for mental health, it's important for us to talk about these polyphenols, or what we call our basically bioactive compounds in plants, which you get in all of your fruits, especially your deeply pigmented or brightly colored fruits and vegetables have the highest amount of these polyphenols. So you talk about, say all your berries and your plums, and more local would be like your jamun and beetroot. So anything which is highly pigmented has more of these polyphenols, which are again very good for gut health and for brain health. Again, all of your dark green leafy vegetables, so talk about your spinach, all of your local greens, and more closer to home, and when we're talking about Indian cooking, we'll use a lot of herbs and spices which also have those compounds in them. So we use obviously a lot of turmeric and cinnamon and clove, and which we've been, I mean, that's just the way we cook, right? It's daily cooking. And that's why I keep going back to saying that it's important for us to go back to our roots and start, staying true to how we normally eat and cook, because that's the way that our ancestors did it, but they did it for a reason, because it actually had, benefits to it. So I think it's important to understand that there are certain, compounds in plant foods that actually benefit your gut and mental health. So the more, like I say, variety and diversity you get in your plant food, the better it is for you. And let's not forget the herbs and condiments and the spices that we anyways use in our Indian cooking. So, let's sort of continue doing that anyway.
I just kind of like a branching off from this topic. Considering caffeine has that effect on us, and considering caffeine is again neither good nor bad, and everything in moderation kind of is ideal for our body. But what a lot of people don't also realize that on a long term basis, uh, caffeine is mainly like, especially in this generation, is used as like a meal replacement or like to meal suppressant. And that on like, again, so considering we're talking about nutrients going to the brain, nutrients going through the gut, uh, caffeine having its own effect of meal, like suppressing hunger. It usually has that thing where after a certain point, your body feels parched of nutrients. It feels kind of that. Do you feel like that effect and that reason is something why people should reduce their caffeine intake? Or is there like a way to, okay, I had caffeine, here is what I can follow it up with. Here is, I can hydrate better. I can eat this. I can, do something to kind of balance it off.
Oh no, definitely. I mean, you're not going to use anything to replace actual food, right? Like I said, moderation is key. You have about 2 or 3 cups of coffee, and that's good. But when you're going to go all day without eating and drinking only coffee, I mean, that's definitely not good for you. So we definitely have to find that balance. And also important to remember, and you probably notice it yourself, that the more you have, the more your body sort of gets used to it in that sense. So if someone's a non-coffee drinker and drinks a cup of coffee, they sort of feel really alert and good, but then eventually that habit sets in. You need more cups of coffee to feel that same effect. So that's going to happen. So that's important to sort of also keep in mind, that we have to make sure that we draw a line somewhere, not just keep piling on the cups of coffee. And also I think when on the topic to coffee, because this coffee culture has also taken India by storm. I mean, our filtered coffee is great. I love South Indian filter coffee, and that's actually the good stuff. But the problem sort of arises when we don't have coffee in its true form, but then we have coffee which is topped with cream, and it has all your syrups and it has everything else. So then you rather not have it at all, because you're not really getting the benefit of the coffee and those polyphenols I was talking about, but you're actually just getting sugar and, all of the other flavorings and additives. So I think that's important to remember, especially if you're talking about the generation now, because, this coffee culture is obviously taken off, and we're not really drinking coffee, but we're really drinking more syrups and, cream and all of that. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. Coffee is good for you to stick to coffee as is. Yes. Yeah.
Nice. The next thing I would like to talk about is actually understanding how, the concept of mindful eating. A lot of people are talking about, like, especially apart from the people who have a certain diet goal, a nutritional goal, a physique goal, their calorie surplus and calorie deficits, understanding how portion control plays a big role into our daily lives. And obviously, that, a lot of people, especially in India, have this issue of eating till we're really full and like kind of stuffing ourselves and like really going beyond the limiting levels of our stomach or limiting levels of our body. And I wanted to know, in terms of quantity, how does that, what would you say is like the ideal portion or the ideal amount? Obviously, it will be different for different people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And but like, there is a big thing about, okay, keep your lunch as the heaviest meal, or keep your breakfast as like some people believe that your breakfast should be like your heavier meal. Some people believe like your dinner should be light. So what are your take on that?
I mean, see, it's difficult to have a blanket rule for everybody in that sense, because we lead such different lives. Some of us need a heavy breakfast in the morning, then we don't need, a heavy dinner. But for some of us, dinner is the only time we get to spend time with the family, and then it's an elaborate meal. So it's very difficult to say, okay, this is how we should do it. I mean, it's easy for us to say, but it's probably difficult to put into practice. But mindful eating is important when it comes to that sense, because basically what is mindful eating is that you're basically utilizing all of your senses, and you're actually enjoying that food. And when you do that, you realize that automatically you don't need so much food. You're sort of satiated with smaller amounts of food, because all of your senses have gone in eating that food, right? So basically, when you're talking about mindful eating practices, we're saying don't sit in front of the screen, don't be talking on your phone, don't eat at your work desk, right? I mean, that's because you're not focusing on the food, and you're so distracted that you're not really enjoying the kind of food that you're taking in, and then you're not satisfied with the food because you don't realize whether you've eaten or not. And it's happened. I mean, I'm guilty of it as well. Sometimes you don't have time to eat. You eat on the go. You're eating in the cab, or you're eating at your work table. And that's not mindful eating, because you're not focusing on the food. But say, for example, and the best experiment to do is basically take a piece of chocolate. Okay, especially for those who are chocolate lovers. And a lot of people say, "Oh, I can't stop at one, square of chocolate. I need to have the entire bar." But if you take that piece of chocolate, place it on your tongue, actually savor that chocolate. No, don't just like gulp it down and bite it, but actually savor it. You'll realize that you just needed that one piece of chocolate. You don't need the entire bar, because you satisfied all of your senses, and you've mindfully eaten that chocolate, that you realize that, okay, I'm done. I don't need so much. And that has to go with all of the food that we're eating. Sit at the table, making sure there are no distractions. You're focusing on that food, and you'll realize you don't need the kind of quantity that you thought you needed, because, and that's something that we can do starting today, rather than sitting at your work table. Make sure that you have a designated place in your house or in your office where you're eating food. Making sure that you're concentrating only on that food, eating it, and you'll realize you get fuller much faster. You're satiated much faster, and you're more appreciative of that food. I think it's something all of us can do, and if you haven't done it before, try that, and you'll realize if you're talking about portion control and portion sizes, it will automatically come through with that, for sure.
Lastly, before we wrap up, I wanted to just delve into how we can make sustainable changes to your diet and to your nutrition, considering a lot of, I don't want, considering that it's a controversial topic in terms of vegetarian and non-vegetarian. And I recently, like me personally, in my experience, I recently turned vegetarian, and my whole focus came to be like sustainable eating. And not only sustainable eating in terms of meat and no meat, also sustainable eating in terms of food waste. and that particularly I know does not have anything to do with mental health, but I felt like this was a good, kind of closing off point, because one aspect of it, I believe, is a lot of people that I've heard is that sometimes when they are very driven to get their protein intake in, or when they're too driven to get their certain kind of, taste buds kind of satisfied in terms of, okay, I'm eating chicken, lamb, beef, these all of these aspects. Do you think that the protein intake that we are obviously having meat on a daily basis, or have meat in excess in our nutritional plan or nutritional routine, do you think it affects our mental state? Do you think the non-vegetarian diet affects our certain mental states? Do you feel like uh, a lot of people, a lot of schools of thought out there are saying, okay, having a vegan diet or having a vegetarian diet really keeps your body in check. There are a lot of different kind of enzymes in the meats that we consume also, no matter, like, obviously not going against whoever that works for, but what is your take on that in terms of the two diets and the two schools of thought?
See, there are so many aspects to it, right? There's the moral aspect of it, there's the religious aspect, the ethical aspect, and obviously a personal choice, right? So, no matter what sort of way you want to go, whether you want to eat meat, you want to go meatless, I think it's important to make sure that you're getting your nutrition in, like we spoke about. For example, vitamins specifically, like your B12, right? You have to make sure that if you're a vegetarian or vegan, make sure you're getting that vitamin via a supplement. Meat eaters don't have to worry too much about it because it's available in animal products. But in saying that, if you're going to be eating too much of meat and not having a good balance of plant foods along with eating meat, that's not good for you either, right? So also in terms of when you're eating meat, there's obviously a higher chance of you taking in a lot of more saturated fats, because animal foods have a higher intake of higher saturated fat content. So I think the balance is important. A lot of the factors when you're talking about mental health talk about a lot of plant forward foods. I'm not saying it has to be a plant-based diet particularly, but it should be plant forward, that you have a lot of variety and diversity from a plant food, but you can also have your meats or dairy or poultry if you want to in limited quantities. So there is space for both of them. But again, obviously, when you're talking about non-vegetarian foods, you're making sure that that quantity doesn't over exceed and you're not going crazy just because you want to hit your protein sort of goals. So making sure that that is balanced out with good amount of diversity of your plants, because like we spoke about your flavonoids and your vitamin your B complex vitamins like your folic acid, they all come from plant foods anyways, right? So I think that balance is very, very important. When you're talking about sustainability, whether you're a meat eater or only a plant eater, I think the best way that we can ensure that we're sustainable is to make sure that we eat foods that are grown locally, that are grown seasonally. I think that is by far the most important thing that we can do to make sure that our environment obviously is safe. We're talking about climate change, all of that. We're talking about people who are growing our foods. We're talking about our farmers. If we eat what's grown locally and what's grown in season, I think that will ensure that we're eating sustainably. We don't have to import avocados and berries for mental health. We can eat local fruit that is available. Take a walk to your farmer's market, figure out what's available in that season, and that will be more than sort of sufficient. So I always give the example of there's this whole thing about kale, right? Like kale is so good for you, but you have enough and more leafy greens that are locally grown. You talk about spinach, you talk about like your green amaranth, you talk about your water spinach. Enough of leafy greens in our Indian sort of local scenario. You don't have to get kale imported to you, right? Or you talk about blueberries, for example, because that obviously there's a lot of work and study around blueberries and its impact on mental health, and that's, I mean, rightly so, it does have that, but you don't get blueberries that easily in our country, and if you're going to import that, again, that's not sustainable living. So look at alternatives that you would get locally. So probably the closest thing is what you get right now is the jamun, because that again is probably the closest relation to your blueberry that you can have, or any other berries that you get locally can be an alternative to blueberry. So I think sustainable living is also figuring out what's grown locally, where's your produce coming from, whether it's your, eating meat or eating plants. I think that's is something that we should keep in mind, because that's going to keep the farmers happy. That's going to keep your environment and your climate in good condition as well.
Carlyne Remedios, thank you so very much for your time
Not at
today.
all. My pleasure. It was a great discussion. I'm glad we did this.
And if you'd like to give any closing thoughts to our audience, if you'd like to, end off summarizing some of the points that you spoke about, the floor is yours.
I think just quickly to sum up what we've already spoken about is nutrients that are important for mental health. Definitely the omega 3s. We're looking at B12. We're looking at your folic acid. We're looking at flavonoids, which you get from all your deeply pigmented fruits and vegetables, and definitely reduce the intake of ultra processed food. I think from a mental health point of view, these should be our take home messages for sure.